First, I'd like to thank the sponsors for this week's class, Jeff and Lori Goldshin. This is a memory of my mother. Thank you very much. And Brian Goldenfeld is in honor of his mother's yahrzeit, Manya Rivka Bas Chaim, and in memory of my mother as well. My apologies for not being here last week. I wish I was able to be here last week. I wish I wouldn't have had to have been in New York. As you are aware, my mother passed away last Sunday evening. She passed away in her sleep at the age of 96 after a short illness. Obviously, I wish she would have been given a few more years. She was in wonderful health just up until this most recent illness. And enjoying her years with her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. For those that were in Shul Shabbos, I'm going to repeat some of the things I said in Shul, some additional things, and then we'll get back to the subject at hand of the chosen people and free choice. My mother grew up in Brooklyn. She's an American-born girl, a New Yorker. She graduated from Eastern District High School in 1944. It was a public school. There weren't too many Jewish girls' schools at the time. And so she would go to this school in the morning, and then in the afternoon and early evening, she would go to a religious school. So she had both her secular education and her Jewish education. When she was about the age of 21, she attended an engagement party of a friend of hers. And there she saw this Hasidic Jew with a beard, an immigrant, a refugee from Poland. And she saw some piety in him, some sincerity in him that she did not see in the boys of her community necessarily, or the school she went to, or the guys her friends were necessarily dating. And she asked her brother to find out more about this fellow. What's his name? Where is he from? And thus began her interest in the man that became my father. Now, I need you to understand the time period. In the 1940s, it wasn't necessarily popular for a New York girl to be dating a Hasidic Jew with a beard. Even though my mother was brought up in an Orthodox home, the New Yorker girls were marrying lawyers and doctors and accountants, professionals, people that were going to make it in life. And these immigrants that came in, these survivors that came in, were treated as the community treats refugees. They looked different. They dressed different. And for my mother to express interest in what was then an immigrant and refugee was surprising, definitely to her friends. Her parents were proud of her. Her parents recognized that they have a daughter that's looking for something deeper, that wasn't necessarily shallow. And they supported the interest of let's find out. When my father, who was just in America for a year at that time, heard that there was this American girl interested in him and dating him, he immediately said that he just arrived, he has no family, he's an orphan, he has no money, he's a yeshiva student, and he just found his freedom after years of being on the run and then spending time in Japan and then spending time in Shanghai. Each of those stays were not pleasant, not easy, and he finally arrived in freedom, and he would like to spend some time studying in yeshiva. That was his initial response. Well, the matchmaker involved wrote a note to the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was the Rebbe at the time, who had a relationship with my father. And he said a shidduch was presented to Mordechai. The last name at the time was Bryski. I'm very thankful to my parents that they dropped the Z at some point and simplified it to Bryski. and that he said he would rather stay in yeshiva. Well, the previous Rebbe ushered my father into an audience and let him know that this is something he should pursue. I'm not telling him he had to get engaged or married, but if someone's presenting with the idea of possibly meeting and dating, you shouldn't push it off. And so they went out. And my father told us that he asked my mother one question. Why? Why would you be interested in me? I have nothing to offer you. I have no funds. I have no family. I have no job. You're a New York girl. My mother was a popular, pretty girl. You can have anyone. Why me? And she said that she wanted something deeper in life and that she wanted an individual that represented truth. And she saw something in him. And they continued dating, and you can imagine the rest is history. They got married, and my father had told my mother while they were dating that he had a mission in life. And he lived with this mission every single day. And that was to take revenge on Hitler, Yamach Shemai, of what he did to his family. And the only way he can take such a revenge would be to rebuild his family and to have the last laugh and to bring many children into the world. My mother, who didn't have that same emotional tie to this as my father did, she was brought up in safety here in this country. Her parents were from Europe, but they came over in the 20s. She signed on. And she said, then let's do it. Let's make that our mission in life. Now, you may have heard that in the Chabad world, people have large families. Big numbers. But back in the 40s, it wasn't that way. Back in the 50s and the 60s, it wasn't that way. Even Chabad families had 3 children, 4 children. 5 children was considered a very large family. My parents started having children. One after the next, after the next, after the next. I can keep going. I am the youngest boy in the family, and I am number 10. I have a younger sister who made number 11. If I remember as a kid growing up, we were the 3rd largest family in all of Crown Heights. It was a very large family. My father worked 3 jobs to support this family. My mother was a perfectionist. What I mean perfectionist is she wanted the home spotless at all times. Tried doing that with 11 children. And the house was always spotless. We didn't have housekeepers. We didn't have cleaning crews. It was a one-woman job. And she would take such pride in the house. On the days that I would be home from school, officially I didn't feel well, maybe because there was a test going on that day or some reason, I would see my mother's schedule, and it was very consistent through most of her life. She would get up early, get the kids off to school. She would then daven herself. She would eat breakfast, and then she would begin. When I say begin, she started going room to room to room in the house, cleaning every single room, every room in the house. We had a 3-story home. I don't see people using furniture polish these days, but she used furniture polish every day. Every piece of furniture needed to shine. I remember the smell of furniture polish. You walked into the house, it just smelled clean. It looked perfect. And then every dinner needed to be prepared with fresh. She would go out on the avenue and do her shopping and begin the cooking process. Her dinners were formal dinners. I don't know if you were brought up in a house where dinner was formal time. There was a time where everyone sat down together for dinner. I don't see it today except for Shabbat. And it had an appetizer, a salad, a soup, a main course, and a dessert every single dinner. And it took a lot of work. But she did it because this was her life. Her family was her life. Her husband was her life, and this mission was her life. And we use the term Yiddish mama. My mother was the epitome of a Yiddish mama, giving herself completely over to others. Well, people often asked us if we ever felt deprived of the attention of our parents because it was such a large family. And I tell you, I never felt a single day deprived of my mother's attention. She would help me with my homework. She would be there for me and for every one of my siblings. She also had a mitzvah of her own. There was something that was very, very dear to her. That as busy as she was at the home, she made it her business to block out time each week for what we call Bikur Cholim. Bikur Cholim is to visit the ill. And she would go once a week to the hospital during the weekdays and evening, and she would visit patients, specifically elderly patients, specifically elderly patients that didn't have family members visiting them. She would often feed them dinner. And then on Shabbos itself, after our lunch at the home, she would walk from our home to Kingsbrook Hospital, which is a long, long walk on Shabbat. It could be about a 30 to 45-minute walk each way. And she would walk as well to visit with patients. That was her mitzvah. She cared very much about those that were ill. The relationship she had with my father was very special. He would do everything in the world for her, everything, whatever he could possibly do. He felt indebted to her. He always felt this. Till the last day of his life, he felt, this woman chose me and didn't have to. And she for him. My father, again, as I mentioned, worked 3 jobs. He would come home usually 10 p.m. at night. He would come home in the middle from 5 to 7 and then go out for a second job, and he had another job on Sundays. There was not a single night after 10 p.m. when he came home that we didn't see him bringing up to my mother a cup of tea and some crackers or cookies. It was a ritual that he kept every single night. He never missed. On Shabbos, on the Shabbat, my father insisted that my mother is the Shabbos queen. He wouldn't allow her to do the dishes ever on the Shabbos. He did it himself. My father would wash the dishes, dry the dishes, put everything away in the kitchen. After Shabbat, we all had a job that my father would give us. You do the vacuuming, you do this, but my mother was not allowed in the kitchen after Shabbat was over to have anything to do with the cleaning of Shabbat. Often I say this, I get into trouble because my wife hears about it, and then she says, "And no, how come you don't learn from your father?" But it's very hard to live up to him, but that's the way he treated my mother, and we watched this. I want to fast forward. In the days leading to my father's passing, we knew he was leaving the world, and he knew he was leaving the world. I was there with him when he got the call from his doctor telling him that the cancer had spread and there's nothing more we can do. I watched him accept it. He then thanked the doctor, praised the doctor, thanked for all the care you've given me. And immediately his attention turned to my mother. He spoke to each and every single one of his children individually. Promise me you'll take care of her. She shouldn't be alone, but don't put her in a nursing home. Take care of her in her home where she wants to live, but be there for her. And he would say this to us in those final days: if anyone wants to honor me, if you want to show any type of honor to me after my passing, then honor your mother. That will be the greatest gift you can give me. The grief that my mother experienced after my father passed away was unbearable. It was hard to watch. It was hard to see. As much as we tried to console each other, my mother would not stop the crying. I did not think, honestly, at that time that there was any chance that she would survive the year. I've never seen a person mourn so deeply like my mother mourned for my father. We brought her out here to California to stay with us for a few weeks, and Tzipora is here sitting because Tzipora helped us during that time take care of my mother when she was here, to try to do anything to bring a smile to her face or to take her mind off the grief. And Tzipora would remember all day was my motto, my motto, my motto. And then somehow, I would say miraculously, she turned. She didn't get over my father, but she was able to see and recognize that the investment that she made and the hard years that she put into raising a family was something right now that was paying her back. I want to recognize here for all of you and for those perhaps watching my appreciation and my recognition first to the aides that lived in my home over the last 11 years to take care of my mother, because they were phenomenal. They cared as if it was their own mother, led specifically by one woman named Bridget, an African-American woman who knows more about Shabbat and kosher and every Jewish holiday and memorized all my siblings' names. It's an amazing feat. She was with my mother when my mother passed away. Treated her like her own mother. But I want to recognize the contribution, first, of God. You know, I'm in the period of grieving now. I've just finished Shiva. You know, we're reading now the book of Genesis, and we're reading about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the difficult years that Jacob had, and the hard years that he had raising a large family. But we're told that Jacob lived the best years of his life, the final years of his life. Why? Because he was able to see the nachas of his family. My mother, in a very strange way, lived the best years of her life and the final years of her life. Obviously, she missed my father tremendously, but she was able to really feel and appreciate and reap the rewards of all the years of the struggles and the difficulties. So I want to thank God for giving her 96 years of good health. It's not often that someone in their 90s are in always good health. I mean, there's pictures of my mother just about a month or two ago. You would never believe she was 96 years old. She looked great. She looked younger than my grandmother did when she passed away. My grandmother was 76 or 77 years old. My grandmother at that time looked much older than my mother did at 96. She was in good spirits. She enjoyed laughing. She enjoyed her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren. She enjoyed chocolate till the very end. She loved ice cream. In fact, had ice cream on the day she passed away. Sunday morning, she did have ice cream. But I thank God. I obviously would have wished God would have heard our prayers and granted her a few extra years, but at the same time, I'm very thankful for the 96 years that he gave us, our mother, in good health. I recognize my father for the foresight he had in setting everything up, that the woman he adored so much, who he felt sacrificed so much for him, would be well taken care of every single day of her life and will lack for nothing. I also recognize one of my older brothers, Shalom Ber, and his wife Sarah, who put their lives on hold to take care of my mother and my father every day of their lives. He literally retired early so that he could be there for my mother, take care of her, In the last 15 years, there hasn't been a single day that he hasn't been in my parents' home, caring for his parents and setting a model example for all of his siblings, his children, his nephews and nieces. I also want to recognize my uncle, and I'll tell you why. My uncle is a great scholar, brilliant mind, was my 7th grade Rebbe, and I still remember the lessons he taught us in 7th grade. He's still teaching till this day. He's my mother's youngest brother. He would have a time to learn with my father in our home every day. So after he would finish teaching, he would come to my home and he would study together with my father. The two of them studied the Talmud together. I believe it was the Wednesday before my father passed away. My father also passed away on a Sunday. And it was the Wednesday, and my father at that point was recognizing that at some point his voice was going to go and he would not be able to communicate. And he would start writing notes. But his brother-in-law, my uncle, came to study with him that Wednesday. And again, I was in the room at the time. And he says to his brother-in-law, Yankel, and he says, I want you to continue to come at this time that you've been coming every single day, even after whatever happens is going to happen. But instead of studying with me, I'm asking you to visit your sister. And my uncle went every single day for 11 years to visit his sister. To see that devotion, that dedication, both to his sister and to his brother-in-law and to his word, is inspiring. I also want to recognize my nephews, my nieces, my great-nephews, my great-nieces, my children, and my grandchildren. Because I haven't seen anything like this in my life, where grandchildren so embraced their grandmother that they would literally visit every day. Our home on Crown Street was visited every single day by my mother's grandchildren and great-grandchildren. There was not a day that went by that she didn't have visit after visit after visit. And that's what kept her alive. That's what kept her spirit up. And these kids, they would know that this was their bubby and they were going to be there. It was so inspiring, so loving. My mother would have her place on her couch in her living room. She would sit there and visitor after visitor would come by. She surrounded the entire dining room, living room, dinette, every part of the whole downstairs with pictures of each and every single grandchild. And literally, the house was almost a museum of pictures now. Every place you could turn, you couldn't sit anywhere because she had pictures now on the chairs wherever you went. Now, I don't think she knew the names of her close to 250 descendants. She knew some because they would visit often, but she would know who do you belong to, which one are you? And then she would entertain them. And she would tell jokes and she would laugh. She loved watching Jewish concerts. We got her one of those, what do you call it, tablets. She loved watching lectures. She would watch our lectures here quite often. Sometimes she memorized them by watching it again and again and again. I was treated as a celebrity when I walked into the house by the aides because they had seen me on TV just about every single day. They thought I was some Hollywood actor. But she's with my father now, but she'll forever be with us. She should have a lichtige Gan Eden. She should go higher and higher in the heavenly worlds together with my father and watch over her entire family and see to it that her entire family is blessed with all the blessings that God can bestow. We are in the middle of the subject of free choice. That's where we left off 2 weeks ago. Hasidic philosophy talks about a concept called ishapcha, and I'll explain what that means. Ishapcha means turning something on its head. Sometimes instead of pushing back against a situation and fighting it, the better approach is to flip it, to reframe it, to redirect it completely. Someone once asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe this. He said, I am struggling with the fact that I have such a big ego. What should I do? How do I get rid of this inflated ego? So surprisingly, the Rebbe's response was, why get rid of it? Now that's not the response you expected to get. You expected to get, you have to do this, and you have to nullify yourself, and you have to live with humility. And the Rebbe says, why should you get rid of it? Why don't you try living up to the great expectations that you have of yourself? You think you're such an important person. Okay, now live up to that. So focus on living up to what your ego is saying you are. Why don't you try to be the amazing person you think you are? Now you have a while to get there, but that should be your focus. Now, although this may seem contrary to classic Hasidic thought that emphasizes nullification and humbling, oftentimes the best way to nullify something negative is not by crushing it and not by suppressing it, but by harnessing its power and transforming it into something positive. Channeling it from a destructive force into a constructive one. So how do we do that? We have to make bold choices. When we're given that opportunity of free choice, we have to find the strength within us to make the bold choice, even when they're not the easiest ones. Because deep within us is the ability, the gift that God has given us to exercise what we can call free choice muscles. We have it within us to exercise them, to learn how we embrace the struggle and push through, to meet the challenges and transcend the obstacles. We all have the ability to change our behavior and to change our lives. Where do we get this from? From our neshama, from our soul. The soul is a part of godliness, and therefore it has a connection to infinite power. If we tune into that soul, we can have the strength within us to battle our own inclinations and to make the right choice. Rabbi Manis Friedman, a great Hasidic scholar out there, lecturer, author, he once related that he was once meeting with a young couple. And this couple was going through a difficult time in their marriage. And at one point in their discussion, in this counseling session, he brought up an idea to them. Why don't you study the laws of family, purity, and mikveh? And see about introducing that into your marriage. Because aside for the spiritual benefit of mikveh, and besides for the fact that it's a mitzvah in the Torah, there is actually a marriage counseling element to it. Because if a husband and wife part ways sexually for 10 days, 12 days, 14 days, whatever the amount of time, it's 12 days plus, of a month, and then they come back together, it's almost like a honeymoon each month. And so there's something there that may bring some magic to your marriage. Anyway, they're listening to this discussion, and they're saying, they never heard of this before. It's the first time they're hearing. They're in total shock. Sounds interesting, sounds fascinating, but we never heard about this. And the strange thing they told him was, when we got married, we decided, although we're both not from Orthodox families, that for the wedding we wanted an Orthodox wedding. So we went to an Orthodox rabbi and we said we would like an Orthodox wedding. And he performed an Orthodox wedding. The food was all kosher, all the blessings were done, the ketubah was done, everything was done Orthodox, because that's what we wanted. And not once did he ever say to us anything about this mikveh thing. Now, if this is part of Judaism and part of Jewish tradition, why didn't he say it to us? We would have done anything at that time because that's what we wanted. Sometime later, months later, Rabbi Friedman had an occasion, he bumped into this rabbi that they had gone to. And he said, can I ask you a question? You know, there was this couple that came to you and wanted to do a wedding, and you did the wedding. Do you remember the name? He said, yeah, I remember. He says, you know, they told me that they never heard anything from you about mikveh. I'm curious, why didn't you share it with them? So the rabbi says, that couple? That they were so far away from everything. I never thought that they would be interested in mikveh. They didn't look the type. They just didn't look the type that would embrace it, understand it, or keep it. So Rabbi Friedman says he's thinking to himself, they didn't look the type? What type of Jew is interested in mikveh? Is it a Jew that has fins and scales? Well, what do you mean they didn't look the type? Every mitzvah in the Torah is there for every single Jew. We're all the type. Now, we have to be educated, we have to learn, we have to be inspired. But there's no such thing that there's a mitzvah in the Torah that doesn't belong to each and every single Jew. I once shared this with you years ago, my first year here, this goes back to first year here as a rabbi, 1983. I arrived in the Caneo Valley at the same time as Rabbi Alan Greenbaum did for Temple Adat Elokim. Anyone remember Rabbi Alan Greenbaum? We became friends. Alan and I became friends. We came to the Caneo about the same month, and we had this very unique friendship between the Reform rabbi and the Chabad rabbi. It was a brotherhood between us. So he invited me to speak to his graduating class of Hebrew school. And I came to Temple Adat Elokim, and I was ready to give my talk. And this is the way Alan introduces me. He says, students, do you remember we studied that in ancient Israel, men put on black boxes on their hand and on their head? He still does it. That was my introduction. Now, kids are looking at me as if I belong in some type of museum. Wow, he found someone from the 17th century and he brought him here. So I got up and I tried to explain to these kids, you still do it too. We all still do it. You just need to learn about it. But it's not something ancient Israel did. Every Jew, everyone in that room, their grandparents did. There's no types of Jews. Every Jew, by their virtue of being part of this family, inherently has within them the ability to make these choices. The free choice is yours. Now, granted, it's not the same from one to the next, because if one is raised in a home with Jewish observance, these choices might be easier. One who is raised without this observance, those choices are going to be more difficult. But the choice has been there, and it's always been there. And every Jew on the face of the earth, whether they call themselves by any label or not, whether they call themselves Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, or any other title that's out there, it makes no difference. Every mitzvah of the Torah belongs to each and every single Jew equally. And we all have to make choices. You know, growing up, I had the privilege of being in the presence of many great people, great holy rabbis, great Rosh Yeshivas, deans of rabbinical schools. I've studied with some of the greatest on the planet. I lived in a community where there were many, many special people. They were impressive, heroic. You hear about their lives and their experiences and their survival and everything. But at the same time, I want to tell you that no less impressive in my life have been the interactions I've had with Jews right here in the Caneo Valley. Now, you may not have the background. You may not have the holiness, the history, but you have this ability to make a choice that the people growing up in Brooklyn and Crown Heights never had to make. They never faced that struggle. They don't know what it's like not to be in a kosher home or not to have Shabbat. and then to make that sacrificial decision to start at some point in their lives? Let's even simplify it. The fact that you're here, the fact that you're taking time off a day to study, that's a free choice decision that you have made. The academy here, pre-COVID days, was attracting some 3,000 students between classes and lectures and workshops all a year. 3,000 Jews that most likely, I would say 99% were not raised in an observant family, and they're choosing to study, choosing to learn. On a spiritual level, that's far more impressive than me growing up in Brooklyn. Because the communities of Borough Park and Crown Heights and Williamsburg and Flatbush and East Flatbush, yes, it's hustling and bustling, and it's beautiful, and it's nice to see the growth, and it's nice to see the schools packed to capacity. All that, I'm not taking anything away from it. But the power of the choice, I see more here in the Canal Valley than I do in New York. The strength that the people in this community have to find somewhere within their soul the strength to make a choice to change, that's the miracle of free choice. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once said, to be a Jew is to be creative, and our greatest creation is ourself. If you think about it, the entire Torah tells stories. And if you look at the characters of the stories of the Bible, you will find that they all reinvented themselves. They all went through a reinvention. Abraham did not grow up Abraham. He grew up in a home of idol worshiping, and he changed himself. Moses started out as a man who, if you remember, has a speech impediment. He doesn't think he has the ability to speak publicly. I am not a man of words, he said. I am a slow speech and tongue. And yet by the end of the Bible, he becomes the most eloquent and visionary of all prophets of all times. He changed himself. Says Rabbi Sachs, whoever we are and however we are programmed, we can channel it to do good, to be good, to feel good, to make the right choices. If we act like the person you want to be, you're going to become that person. That comes from free choice. I'm going to close today with this story. You know, the suffering of the Greek Jewry during World War II may not be as well known as Jews from other European countries. But the Jews of Greece actually endured a greater percentage of loss than almost any other country. Percentage-wise, they had very few survivors. 85% of the Jews of Salonika were killed, most of them in Auschwitz. There were a few that survived and rebuilt their lives anew. I want to tell you a story about two of the survivors. It was a young man named Ovadia Baruch, who after having a number branded on his arm, felt his life seeping out of him. He was all alone, no family, no friends. He walked around the concentration camp like a zombie. But then, to his great fortune, he was given the job in the camp to dole out the soup. That was considered the top job. Why? Because you got to get some extra food yourself, and you got to take some of the extra food and give it out to others. So he felt fortunate that A, he was working this job, and B, that he would be in a position to help starving Jews. On the other side of the camp was a young woman. Her name was Eliza. Also from Greece, but she wasn't given one of those plum assignments. In fact, she was sent to the dreaded Block 10. What was Block 10? Block 10 was where the cursed Nazis, Yamach Shemam, they conducted their grotesque medical experiments, robbing young women of their ability to bear children. And that's where Eliza was sent. And she's heading to that infirmary. She knows she has already heard what goes on there, and she's being led there. She was filled with trepidation, with fear, but she tries to strengthen herself before walking up those steps. Come what may, I must survive. Come what may, I must survive. She enters the clinic from hell. She looks up and she sees something that filled her with new levels of hate and disgust. As much as she was trying to encourage herself, it all fell apart because she recognized the doctor that was going in and out performing those experimental procedures was none other than Dr. Jacob Samuels, a Jewish doctor. So when it was her turn, she looks up at this doctor, and with every ounce of anger building up inside, she yells at him, "How could you? It's one thing for these Nazi animals to be doing this to us, but you're a Jew. For what? To save your own hide? So that you can get some extras from them? For that you're doing this to us?" And berated him with anger. A few moments later, the procedure was done. It was over. Procedure that would prevent Eliza from ever having children. She was shattered, she was broken. Back to that same of many survivors. Why survive in the first place? Why live? A few days later, Eliza was walking past the back of the kitchen area and she hears someone screaming in the Greek language. She knows the language. She hears the cries in her native tongue. She runs and she sees behind the kitchen there's an SS guard beating a young man that she did not know. She only knew that if she didn't do something quickly, this young man would be killed. So she begins yelling at the top of her lungs for the Nazi to stop beating him. And for some inexplicable reason, her cries stopped the savage attack. The Nazi just ran off. As the Nazi runs away, she sees this Jew bleeding on the ground. And it was this Ovadia Baruch, who I started my story with, that was being beaten. He thanks his Savior profusely, and being a fellow landsman from Greece, they spoke for a few minutes. He was so overwhelmed by emotions at the moment that he blurts out to Eliza on the spot, "If we both survive, let's get married." Eliza couldn't help but burst out laughing. "We know each other for 5 minutes. What do you mean, let's get married?" And besides, she adds, "if you did get to know me, you wouldn't want to marry me." And then they both went their separate ways. Over the next 2 years, their paths did not cross again. Even so, it stayed in Ovadia's mind, this woman that saved him. When the war was over and the camps were liberated, he began to search high and low for Eliza. He hit many dead ends, but then after many months, he found her. He located her. Although they didn't see each other in over 2 years, Ovadia didn't forget her kindness. Now, removed from the horrors of the camp, her outer beauty was matched by her inner beauty. And once again, in spontaneous fashion, he says, "Let's get married. Let's start our lives together. Now we can date, we can get to know one another. Let's do it." Now the question was serious and for real. So she had to reveal to him what she knew about her body and why she thought he would never want to marry her if he found out. And she says, "I was taken to Barrack 10. I will never give birth to children. Find yourself a wife that will bring children into your life. I'm not for you." Ovadia says, "I don't care. I want to marry you. Maybe we'll devote ourselves to some children's program. We'll find a way to fill the void, but I want you. Maybe we'll adopt, but I want you. I don't want to find someone else. I want you." And after much persuasion, Eliza agrees to get married to Ovadia. Sometime later, they were given the opportunity to travel to the land of their dreams, and Ovadia and Eliza moved to Israel. A few months later, Eliza wasn't feeling well. She went to see a doctor, and after examining her, he told her the good news. You're pregnant. She says, Doctor, you're making a mistake. It's impossible. She said, I was taken to Barrack 10. They did the procedure on me. I can't have children. They did another test, and the doctor says, I'm telling you, you are pregnant with a child. They're overjoyed and confused, and they began to do some research, and they discovered that there were many others like her that were taken to Barrack 10 and had Dr. Samuels and were pregnant with children. It was then that they discovered that this Dr. Samuels put his life on the line and made believe he was doing procedures on these women, but really doing something that would not affect their ability to have children. The Germans ultimately did discover his charade. They tortured him, and then they executed him. 6 months later, as Eliza and Ovadia were holding their beautiful newborn baby at the bris, and they named him Yaakov, after Dr. Jacob Samuels of saintly memory. When faced with the most critical and consequential choice points of life, our people didn't choose the easy way. They chose the hard path. And is indebted to them and thanks to them and in gratitude to them that we, the Jews of freedom today, are able to practice the way we practice. I conclude, as human beings, we have the power of free will. We're able to make choices that can better our lives and the lives of others. We can make the world a better place and a brighter place when we're presented with these opportunities and we find the strength within our soul to make that right choice. We'll continue in text next week. Next week will be the last class of the fall semester. We'll also have some jelly donuts for you because next week will be Hanukkah, so we'll celebrate Hanukkah together. That will be the last week, and then we'll start up again in January. But we will do some text next week inside the Chumash. Thank you very much for joining.
The existing handout, or we're getting it?
Existing. I think this needs a battery.
I think it needs a battery. Then don't worry, we got everything.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I was confused why,
It just went off.
Why it wasn't working, yeah. Yeah,
Just remember to get a new battery.
yeah. I'll put a new one in there.
Thanks a lot, Jacob.
Yeah, of course.